Just as I was about to pour myself a glass of wine to calm my nerves, there came a sharp rap on the front door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Who could be out there in this weather, knocking on doors in the middle of the night? I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to answer, but then the knocking came again, more urgent this time. With trembling hands, I made my way to the door and peered through the peephole. Standing on the porch was a bedraggled figure, soaked to the bone, and clutching a drenched coat around his shivering form. He pounded on the door again, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Please, open up. I need help." I hesitated, torn between my instinct to help and my fear of letting a stranger into my home. But something about the desperation in his voice touched a chord deep within me, and before I knew it, I was unbolting the door and ushering him inside. As the stranger stepped into the warmth of my home, I couldn't help but notice how haggard he looked, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted expression that spoke of untold hardship. He introduced himself as Mark, explaining that his car had broken down several miles away, and he had been wandering through the storm for hours, searching for shelter. I offered him a towel to dry off and a cup of hot tea to warm him up, all the while casting nervous glances at the clock, willing John to call and reassure me that he was safe. But the phone remained silent, and my anxiety only grew as Mark recounted his tale of woe. "It's been a rough night," he said, taking a grateful sip of tea. "I never imagined the storm would be this bad. I was on my way to visit my sister when my car conked out on me. I tried to fix it myself, but I'm no mechanic. I was starting to lose hope when I saw your house up ahead. Thank you for letting me in." I nodded sympathetically, though a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something about Mark's story didn't quite add up. But I pushed aside my doubts, chiding myself for being paranoid. After all, he was just a weary traveler in need of assistance. As the minutes ticked by, the storm outside showed no sign of abating, and I realized with a sinking feeling that Mark would have to spend the night here. I showed him to the guest room, promising to make up the sofa for myself in the living room. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the wind howling outside, sleep eluded me, and my mind was consumed with worry for John and the unsettling presence of a stranger under my roof. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the storm having passed during the night, leaving behind a trail of destruction in its wake. I rose early, eager to see if John had returned home safely, but when I checked my phone, there were still no messages or missed calls from him. Frowning, I tried calling his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic clawed at my throat as I dialed his office number, praying that someone would pick up and tell me he was okay. After what felt like an eternity of waiting on hold, a receptionist finally answered, her voice tinny and distant through the phone's speaker. "Johnson and Associates, how may I help you?" I barely managed to choke out my words, my voice thick with fear. "This is Mrs. Johnson. Is John there? I've been trying to reach him all night, but he hasn't called me back." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of typing as the receptionist checked something on her computer. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson, but Mr. Johnson hasn't checked in yet. He was supposed to return from his trip last night, but his flight was delayed due to the storm. I can try paging him for you if you'd like." I thanked her numbly and hung up the phone, my mind reeling with 1,000 worst-case scenarios. Where could John be? Was he stranded somewhere, injured or worse? I paced the living room, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself down. Just then, there came a knock at the door, and my heart leaped into my throat. Could it be John, finally home safe and sound? I rushed to answer it, only to find a uniformed police officer standing on the porch, his expression grave. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Officer Stevens. May I come in?" I nodded mutely, my mouth dry with dread, as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Officer Stevens wasted no time in getting to the point, his voice low and serious as he spoke. The rain came down in torrents, lashing against the windows with a fierce intensity that seemed to match the turmoil brewing inside me. My husband John was away on one of his frequent business trips, leaving me alone in our large, secluded house nestled in the countryside. Normally, I didn't mind the solitude, finding solace in the quiet and the chance to indulge in my hobbies undisturbed. But tonight, with the storm raging outside, the emptiness of the house felt suffocating. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but every crash of thunder made me jump, and every flash of lightning illuminated the room in an eerie glow that sent shivers down my spine. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight, and John still hadn't called to check in. Anxiety gnawed at my insides as I imagined all the terrible things that could be happening to him out there in the storm. Mrs. Johnson, I'm afraid I have some bad news. There have been reports of a string of break-ins in the area, and we believe your house may be next on the list. My blood ran cold at his words, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Break-ins? Here in our quiet little corner of the countryside? It seemed impossible, and yet the fear in Officer Stevens' eyes told me that this was no idle threat. We've increased patrols in the area, but I would advise you to take extra precautions, he continued. Keep your doors and windows locked at all times, and if you see or hear anything suspicious, don't hesitate to call 911. I nodded numbly, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. What if John came home while the intruder was still lurking nearby? What if he walked into a trap, unaware of the danger he was in? The thought was enough to send me into a panic, and I clutched at Officer Stevens' arm, my voice trembling as I begged him for help. You have to find him, officer, I pleaded. You have to bring him back to me. I can't bear the thought of losing him. Officer Stevens nodded sympathetically, his grip firm and reassuring as he gave my arm a comforting squeeze. We'll do everything we can to find your husband, Mrs. Johnson, he said. But in the meantime, you need to stay calm and stay safe. Can I trust you to do that? I nodded, my eyes brimming with tears as I thanked him for his help. But even as he left, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud, threatening to engulf me in its shadow. The hours dragged by in agonizing slowness as I waited for news of John, my anxiety mounting with each passing minute. I tried to distract myself with household chores, but every creak of the floorboards or rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing, and I found myself jumping at shadows. As night fell once again, I fortified myself with a glass of wine and huddled on the sofa, my eyes fixed on the front door, as if willing it to stay closed. But no sooner had I settled in than there came a soft scratching sound from outside, followed by the unmistakable click of the lock being tampered with. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized with horror that someone was trying to break into the house. I crept to the window and peered through the curtains, my breath catching in my chest as I saw a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, a crowbar in hand. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave as I raced to the phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling so violently that I could barely hold onto the receiver. But before I could utter a word, there came a crash from the front door, followed by the sound of splintering wood as it gave way under the force of the intruder's attack. With a cry of terror, I bolted for the safety of the kitchen, my heart pounding in my ears as I fumbled for the drawer where we kept the emergency supplies. My hands closed around the handle of a kitchen knife, and I clutched it tightly, my knuckles white with fear as I prepared to defend myself against whoever was coming for me. But just as I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation, there came a shout from the hallway, followed by the sound of scuffling and grunts of pain. I peeked around the corner and gasped in astonishment as I saw Mark, the stranger from the night before, wrestling with the intruder, his face contorted with rage as he fought to protect me from harm. As I watched in stunned disbelief, Mark managed to overpower the intruder and pin him to the ground, his knee pressing down on the man's chest as he struggled to break free. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I relayed the details of the break-in to the dispatcher on the other end of the line. Within minutes, the police arrived and took the intruder into custody, his face twisted with rage as he spat curses and threats at me from the back of the patrol car. I shivered at the sight of him, grateful beyond words for Mark's timely intervention and the swift response of the authorities. As the officers took my statement and gathered evidence from the scene, Mark approached me with a sheepish smile, his eyes filled with concern. "I'm sorry to have put you through this, Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice quiet and sincere. "I never meant for things to turn out like this. I just wanted to help." I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, as I tried to make sense of the events that had unfolded. How had Mark known about the break-in? And why had he risked his life to protect me, a complete stranger? Sensing my confusion, Mark took a deep breath and began to explain. "I wasn't entirely truthful with you last night," he admitted. "I'm not just a traveler passing through. I'm actually an undercover detective, working on a case involving a notorious gang of thieves who've been targeting homes in the area. When I saw your house, I knew it was only a matter of time before they came after you too." I blinked in astonishment, my mind reeling with disbelief. A detective? Here, in my house? It seemed too incredible to be true, and yet the evidence was staring me right in the face, from the handcuffs dangling from his belt to the badge glinting on his chest. "But why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice tinged with hurt. "Why put me through all this agony, thinking you were just another helpless stranger in need of assistance?" Mark looked away, his expression pained. "I wanted to protect you, Mrs. Johnson," he said softly. "I didn't want to scare you or put you in danger. But when I saw that man trying to break into your house, I knew I couldn't stand by and do nothing. I had to do whatever it took to keep you safe, even if it meant blowing my cover." I nodded, my eyes brimming with tears as I reached out to grasp his hand. "Thank you, Mark," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for saving my life." In the days that followed, the police launched a full investigation into the break-in and apprehended several members of the gang responsible for terrorizing the neighborhood. John returned home safely, his face pale and drawn with worry as he held me close, grateful beyond words for my safety. As we sat together in the warmth and comfort of our home, I couldn't help but reflect on the events that had brought us to this moment. From the stormy night when I first opened the door to a stranger in need, to the harrowing ordeal of the break-in and the revelation of Mark's true identity, it had been a roller coaster of fear and uncertainty. But through it all, I had found strength I never knew I possessed, drawing on my instincts for survival and the unwavering support of those who loved me. And though the scars of that night would always linger, I knew that I had emerged from the darkness stronger and braver than ever before. As I gazed out at the peaceful countryside, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, I felt a sense of closure wash over me like a warm embrace. The nightmare was finally over, and I was free to embrace the future with renewed hope and optimism, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them head on, armed with the knowledge that I was capable of overcoming anything life threw my way.